On a winter night in 39 AD, Rome held its breath. Not because of the cold, but because every family knew what this night meant. Somewhere in the city, a daughter would vanish. Picture yourself at 14, wrapped in your night clothes. The world outside your window feels quiet, almost peaceful. Then it happens. Armored footsteps echo down your street, heavy and deliberate. You were raised to believe that a summons from the Emperor was an honor. No one ever told you it could come without warning. No one told you soldiers could enter your home as if it already belonged to them. And no one explained why they carried a lantern wrapped in red cloth, why they would set it down in front of your door like a sentence already passed. Soon, your mother will whisper your name, afraid that speaking louder might offend the gods. Your father will try to smile, even though it breaks him to do so. And in those few unbearable moments, you will learn the truth every noble family fears. The Palatine does not invite daughters, it takes them. And if you think this is where Flavia's nightmare begins, you're mistaken. What waits for her inside the palace will make this moment feel merciful. This is not legend. This was the night the Garden of Venus opened. A ritual so horrifying that Rome erased every trace of it. If buried truths like this fascinate you, subscribe to History Rewinded and leave a like. And when you reach the moment that unsettles you most, tell me where you're watching from. Let's begin. The first to learn the truth will be Flavia. Remember her, because everything you're about to hear shaped the man who will soon decide her fate. To understand how a human being can decay from within and become capable of devouring an empire, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the bloodline that produced him. Back to the shadows that formed him long before Rome learned to fear his name. Caligula was not born insane. He was born into greatness. He was the son of Germanicus, Rome's golden general, a man whose presence could steady an army and ignite a city. Caligula should have inherited honor, discipline, and strength. Instead, something far more corrosive took root in him. His childhood did not unfold in peaceful villas or lecture halls. It unfolded at the brutal edge of the empire, in military camps soaked in sweat, iron, and the sharp scent of war. He learned to walk between ranks of hardened soldiers, the earth trembling beneath their marching boots. The legionaries adored him. They dressed him in miniature armor and called him Caligula, Little Boot, a name spoken with affection, never knowing how dark its legacy would become. But even then, something inside him twisted. That frontier life taught him its first rule. Power is not given, it is seized. And once you take it, you never apologize for how you use it. A fracture formed in the boy's soul, and it was only the beginning. The real shattering came with the sudden death of Germanicus. In a single stroke, the beloved child became a threat. Caligula watched as his mother and brothers were exiled, imprisoned, and killed, one after another. No invading army, no foreign enemy, just the cold will of Emperor Tiberius. Then came Capri. Rome imagined Capri as a place of peaceful retirement. What truly existed there was something far darker. Behind its palace walls, monstrous habits festered, and Caligula was forced to live among them. Barely more than a child, he was made to coexist with the man who destroyed his family. Capri was no sanctuary. It was a luxurious prison sealed by paranoia. For 6 suffocating years, Caligula lived under the constant watch of an emperor who trusted no one and killed without hesitation. There, he learned a second rule, far darker than the first. To survive, you must smile at the man you want dead. He buried every tear. He swallowed every surge of rage. He bowed to the killer of his bloodline, outwardly obedient, inwardly unraveling. The fractures in his mind spread wider and wider until something cold and bitter began to take hold. So when Tiberius finally died and the Senate raised Caligula, only 24 years old, to the throne, Rome exploded with relief. A new beginning, a fresh ruler. The son of Germanicus would cleanse the empire, and for a short time, he did. He released prisoners, destroyed the records of secret informers, lifted hated taxes. He poured gold into festivals, games, and public celebrations. The city rejoiced. Rome believed it had been rescued, but the man who would one day reach for Flavia had not yet fully emerged. His darkness was only beginning to stir. Then, near the end of that first year, Caligula was struck by a sudden illness, so severe that he hovered between life and death. And when he rose from his bed, something essential was missing. The boy who learned to hide his hatred on Capri no longer needed to hide at all. Standing atop the Palatine Hill, gazing down at a city that worshipped him, Caligula grasped a terrifying realization. At the summit of absolute power, there are no gods above you, only victims below. The cheers of the crowds and the fearful silence of the Senate did not humble him. His sanity peeled away like dead skin. Beneath it emerged the creature Capri had shaped. Generosity warped into obsession. Justice rotted into cruelty. And in the darkness of his thoughts, an idea took form. Women of noble blood were no longer daughters. They were not citizens. They were tools. And the first tool he would test was waiting. On a night Flavia did not yet know would destroy her life. This change did not crash down on Rome like thunder. It crept in quietly, like a disease. Slow, invisible. Poison seeping beneath marble floors and into patrician homes, until it reached those who believed they were untouchable. Elsewhere in Rome, Flavia's household heard the same knock. The knock no family dared open, yet none were permitted to refuse. It began as a visit. The emperor's heralds arrived without drawn blades. Instead, they carried scrolls sealed in imperial purple, a color that represented survival or annihilation. Inside was a command no parent could decline. Send your daughter. Not just any daughter, but the one deemed most beautiful, most unblemished, most useful to the empire's politics. Families spoke of it as an honor. In truth, they knew it was a death sentence wrapped in ceremony. Refusal was treason. Obedience meant surrendering your child to a ruler who viewed mercy as weakness. The girls were taken to a remote section of the palace, a place Caligula named with deliberate cruelty, the Garden of Venus. When Flavia crossed its threshold, she still believed she had some control over her fate. That belief would not survive the night. At first glance, the garden looked like paradise. Soft-colored marble walls, lavish beds, rare perfumes drifting through the air. Servants moved silently, attending to every request before it was spoken. The daughters of Rome entered believing they had been chosen for sacred or ceremonial roles. Slowly, painfully, the truth emerged. The beauty was only the surface. Beneath it lay confinement. And the real purpose of the garden, the horror hidden within it, revealed itself in stages. The most terrifying part was that nothing happened quickly. The system was designed to dismantle them gradually, forcing each girl to understand every step of her own loss. The jewels they were required to wear were not ornaments. They were symbols of ownership, heavy, cold reminders that they now belonged to the state. The fine garments were no better. They were meant not to protect or comfort, but to strip away privacy and autonomy. The first thing Caligula erased was their names. Names meant identity, and identity meant resistance. He replaced them with numbers, cruel nicknames, and mocking titles spoken casually, as if they were objects. With every erased name, the garden tightened its hold. Yet the most powerful weapon was not fear alone. It was waiting. A punishment that left no visible wounds but hollowed the spirit completely. The girls never knew when they would be summoned. It could be hours. It could be weeks. Every moment in between was filled with dread. The sound of guards in the corridor was enough to stop their breath. Sleep became rare. Calm became impossible. Long before the emperor ever addressed them directly, the damage had already been done. They were broken down by anticipation alone. When the summons finally came, it did not lead to privacy. It led to the emperor's evening gatherings, formal banquets attended by Rome's most powerful men. The young women were displayed before the elite, not as guests, but as decorations. Caligula moved among them with deliberate arrogance, commenting openly, judging, ranking, and humiliating them to assert dominance. Yet the deepest cruelty was not his voice. It was the silence that followed. Fathers, relatives, and future husbands sat at honored tables, forced to endure the spectacle without protest. Any sign of anger or distress could mean immediate punishment or death. Their forced smiles became masks of survival. That silence was its own form of violence. What followed was never chaos. It was ritualized, controlled, planned with care. Music masked what could not be spoken aloud. Chosen witnesses watched in enforced approval. Every movement followed unspoken rules. This was not indulgence. It was theater. A demonstration that the emperor claimed authority not just over bodies, but over identity, dignity, and will. Standing beneath torchlight, Flavia understood something terrifying. Caligula no longer saw her as human. She was a lesson, a space in which he practiced power. When she first arrived, Flavia still believed she might serve in ceremonies or act as a visible companion of the court. For days, Caligula reinforced that illusion. He gave gifts, spoke gently, displayed false care. It was a deliberate strategy. When the illusion finally collapsed, Flavia learned the single law that ruled the palace. You cannot defy a man who believes himself divine. Caligula alternated cruelty with affection, punishment with reward. One day harshness, the next false tenderness and extravagant gifts. This instability rewired the mind. Fear and hope became inseparable. The one who inflicted harm became the only source of relief. Escape became unthinkable. Then he destroyed solidarity. Flavia tried to fade into the background, but invisibility offered no safety. In the garden, being overlooked could be just as dangerous as being noticed. Caligula ranked the girls openly. Who pleased him? Who failed him? Who would be rewarded? Who would suffer? He turned them against one another, forcing competition where compassion might have survived. Each girl began to see the others not as allies, but as threats. Once unity was gone, the emperor controlled everything. And when he finally grew bored with one of them, he did not release her. He sold her. Within the palace walls, secret arrangements transferred broken young women to powerful men, senators, generals, and allies, ensuring loyalty through shared guilt and silence. The Garden of Venus was not a place of pleasure. It was a system, and it worked. These were the same men who governed Rome by daylight. Caligula forced them to participate in his crimes, binding them to him through shared disgrace. Guilt became the strongest chain of all. The empire's elite were no longer just complicit. They were trapped by their own silence. The humiliation did not end there. Families were commanded to express gratitude. Some fathers were ordered to host public feasts after their daughters had been destroyed by the palace. They raised cups in false celebration, swallowing their horror as if it were poison. On the Palatine, honor became another word for despair. At the same time, surveillance tightened relentlessly. There was no safety anywhere. Guards, servants, informants, eyes were everywhere. Even a muted cry in the night could be reported as rebellion. Inside the Garden of Venus, every remaining layer of humanity was slowly stripped away. What remained was fear, exhaustion, and the constant sound of footsteps drawing closer. By 40 and 41 AD, the palace had become unbearable even to those who served it. The girls who once arrived with hope and gentle voices now moved like shadows through the corridors. Many stopped speaking. Others stopped reacting at all. Their minds withdrew inward, retreating to the last place the emperor could not reach. Court physicians described dissociation, souls separating from bodies as a way to endure what could not be escaped. But the truth the palace worked hardest to hide was even darker. Deaths began to occur. Officially, only a handful were acknowledged. Unofficially, everyone knew the number was far higher. The rest were erased quietly, buried beneath marble floors and imperial denial. Flavia existed in the space between collapse and survival. Too frightened to die, too broken to live. She began to wonder whether endurance itself was the cruelest punishment. What once terrified them all now seemed like the only imaginable release, a final choice in a world where everything else had been taken, even their names. For many, despair became absolute. Yet even this was not enough for Caligula. Lost in his delusion of divinity, he devised another cruelty, one that wounded his victims through the people they loved most. He permitted parents to visit their daughters, not to help them, not to save them, but to witness their suffering. The girls were dressed carefully, perfumed, forced to smile. Bruises were hidden, terror concealed beneath paint and trembling composure. Under the watch of armed guards, families were made to pretend this was a celebration. If a mother faltered, she was punished. If a daughter broke her role, her family paid the price. Everyone was trapped inside a grotesque performance, while the architect of their pain observed with satisfaction. But Caligula made the mistake every tyrant eventually makes. He turned his cruelty toward the men who carried weapons. Breaking women was no longer enough. He sought to humiliate the foundations of Rome itself. Senators were forced to endure unbearable spectacles involving their families. Commanders of the Praetorian Guard were mocked and degraded before their own troops. Honored soldiers were compelled to submit to public insults designed to strip away dignity. Among them was Cassius Chaerea, a hardened veteran and former loyalist of Germanicus. Caligula singled him out relentlessly. The emperor believed himself untouchable, immortal. He was wrong. The resentment within Chaerea and others stopped being political. It became existential. Caligula was no longer a ruler. They saw him as a disease destroying the state from within. Eventually, the tension reached its breaking point. During public games on the Palatine, Caligula departed through a private underground passage, confident that no harm could reach him. In the dim corridor, the conspirators confronted him. There were no speeches, no warnings, only decisive action. The man who demanded worship fell not as a god, but as a mortal. His reign ended in silence and shock. Nearby, sealed inside the Garden of Venus, the young women heard chaos echo through the palace, shouting, running feet, confusion. They huddled together, trembling, unable to tell whether this meant freedom or a new terror. Then came quiet. Not the heavy silence of oppression, but the unfamiliar stillness left behind when a monster disappears. Yet none of them moved. Years inside the palace had taught them a single, terrible truth. In Rome, the end of one nightmare often marked the beginning of another. Their fear was justified. Caligula's death did not bring a new golden age. It created a vacuum. When his Germanic bodyguards discovered their emperor was dead, they erupted in uncontrolled rage. Within moments, the palace descended into chaos. Servants, officials, and anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path were cut down. For the young women still trapped inside, the Garden of Venus turned into a place of mortal danger. Some fled barefoot through endless corridors, shattered glass beneath their feet, bodies strewn in their wake. Others, immobilized by years of conditioning, locked themselves inside rooms, clinging to one another in the dark, waiting to learn whether the next knock would bring rescue or death. Hours later, when the violence finally subsided, an unlikely figure was dragged into the light. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, long dismissed as weak and insignificant, was pulled from hiding and proclaimed emperor. Claudius understood immediately what was at stake. If the truth of the Garden of Venus emerged, its system, its witnesses, the involvement of noble families, the empire itself could fracture. So he made a choice. For the survivors, Rome did not offer justice. It offered compensation, a cold, calculated solution designed to smother the truth before it could spread. The young women were returned to their families, dressed in gold, wrapped in costly fabrics, and given dowries large enough to buy silence. Every gift carried the same unspoken order. Forget. Forget what happened. Forget who allowed it. Forget the daughters Rome sacrificed to a ruler who was never a god at all. No trials followed. No collaborators were punished. Rome folded the truth into darkness and sealed it beneath official silence. The girls went home, but the people who returned were not the same. Their bodies survived, but their spirits had been left behind on the Palatine Hill. In Roman society, a noble woman's value was cruelly tied to reputation. Though they were victims, children crushed by a system beyond their control, the stain followed them relentlessly. Family honor mattered more than truth, more than compassion, more than their lives. Many were never allowed to marry. Many were quietly hidden away in distant wings of family estates, removed from public view like unwanted reminders. Their suffering followed predictable patterns. Sudden touches triggered terror. Unexpected sounds brought panic. Sleep offered no refuge, only relentless memories. Their confinement had ended, but the prison inside their minds remained. Freedom was not a victory. It was a sentence, a lifetime spent trapped within themselves. Rome looked away, as it always had. It was easier to blame the women than to confront its own corruption. Easier to bury a crime than to admit the foundations were rotten. Because the truth of Caligula's reign was never about one man. It was about the system that created him, protected him, and allowed the Garden of Venus to exist at all. Later historians would debate the details. Some would question exaggerations. Others would argue over motives. But taken together, the sources tell us one undeniable fact. A machine of abuse existed, and Rome allowed it to function in silence. This was not an isolated atrocity. It was a structural failure. Rome concentrated legal, military, judicial, and even divine authority into the hands of one individual, without limits, without safeguards, without recourse when the wrong person held power. Caligula revealed how thin the boundary truly is between order and brutality, between ruler and monster. That boundary was drawn not on marble or law, but on the lives of unnamed girls erased from history. Rome built wonders that endured for centuries: roads, aqueducts, laws, monuments. Yet it failed at the most basic responsibility of any society: to protect the vulnerable from those at the top. This story is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a warning. A civilization may reach extraordinary heights, but if it sacrifices human dignity along the way, its legacy will not be remembered for greatness, only for shame. History is often written by those who win. But shadows persist. Erased names, unsent letters, tears absorbed into silk pillows. They survive in the margins Rome tried to burn away. Now those shadows belong to us. We must decide whether to confront them or repeat them. Because evil does not always arrive with fire and blades. Sometimes it wears authority. Sometimes it hides behind silence. And sometimes it thrives simply because too many people choose not to object. If this story unsettled you, let it. If it angered you, let it. And if it forced you to consider the cost of unchecked power, then the voices Rome tried to erase have finally been heard.